Hi all, Sam Aronow here, and it's time to talk about the Jewish War. Now, this is actually part of a much longer Roman Talmudic series that will be ongoing, but frankly, I had to set some time aside to talk about the First Jewish-Roman War because it's a huge deal, and this is going to be a long series with a lot else to talk about. I'm extremely grateful to have found an audience to take me up over 1,000 subscribers. It's a real turning point, and it's especially poignant on the first anniversary of the beginning of my Jewish history series. First up, some archaeology news. Recently, 93 bodies found in Bronze Age tells in Israel and Jordan were compared against modern populations in both countries, and concluded that most Jews and Arabs in the southern Levant share most of their DNA with these Canaanite specimens. These modern populations also share large chunks of DNA with ancient specimens from Europe, the Horn of Africa, and intriguingly Iran, suggesting an ancient and heretofore unknown migration from the Zagros Mountains. Meanwhile, archaeologists in Tel Arad have discovered traces of cannabis at the high place alongside frankincense. This means that cannabis was used by ancient Jews as a sacrificial incense for the old gods, and raises the possibility that it was also used in the Jewish temple. Now, due to religious and political sensitivities, the Waqf, which is the Jordanian body overseeing the Temple Mount, doesn't allow archaeological digs there, so we just have to guess. I'm not an archaeologist, but it seems to me more likely that cannabis would have been used in the first temple, but not the second. Because if it was used in the Second Temple period, I think that knowledge would have been preserved, if not in the Bible, then in the Mishnah, but more evidence remains to be found. In another story brought to me in the comments, DNA testing has begun on the Dead Sea Scrolls to see what kind of animal skins they were written on. For context, many of the Dead Sea Scrolls were not found intact, or in one place even. This was the 1940s, this was the British Empire, and a lot of artifacts were looted and traded. What this DNA testing has revealed is that many scroll fragments that we previously thought belonged together actually came from different animals, and sometimes even different species of animal, like some from sheep and some from cows. This has highlighted that many of the biblical scrolls are actually from different versions of the Bible, which is something I will eventually talk about when we reach the Masoretic text. But this raises the possibility that the people living at Qumran, who placed these scrolls in the cave where they were originally found, were not Essenes, but rather people who happened to have access to Essene writings, which already puts my Hasmonean Dynasty episode out of date. So what's really exciting about covering the Jewish War is that it's the first war that I've discussed that, at least within Israel and its general neighborhood, has actual preserved battlefields that you can go see, and I'm going to go over some of them from the early part of the war. First of all, the mosaic floor of the Caesarea Synagogue, where the war really started, is still there. It's at the northern end of the ruins by the aqueduct, and when I wrote my book, An Armada of Cats, I actually walked right by it without even knowing it was there. The Synagogue of Caesarea actually did continue to stand after the war, and in fact it would become important in a later Jewish-Roman war, but I'll leave that for another time. Yodfat has a modern memorial to the battle, which is empirically strange, but if you wanted to build a memorial to an ancient battle, and you could, why wouldn't you? The modern kibbutz of Yodfat, by the way, is on the opposite hill where the Romans were stationed, and ancient Yodfat is a preserved archaeological site. But the real pristine battlefield, in my opinion, is Gamla. I didn't mention Gamla in the video because it really was not an important battle, but they have unearthed all manner of siege works and Roman weapons, and as an added bonus, it's in this really dramatic landscape of high plains and canyons in the Golan Heights, so if you are really interested in this war, go to Gamla. Another question I got is what the relationship is between Joseph Ben Gurion and Israel's first Prime Minister David Ben Gurion. So at this time, surnames did not exist in the Jewish world. In the Roman sphere, you had your given name, your gens, which was like your clan, your family name, and your taken name, which was like a name given to you honorarily or like a nickname. But in Judea, it was your name and then son or daughter of your father's name, followed by your noble title in the rare case that you had one. So Josephus, for instance, would in the original Hebrew be Yosef ben Matityahu HaKohen. So there is no implicit relationship between Joseph ben Gurion and David ben Gurion. However, David ben Gurion actually purposely changed his name from Green to Ben Gurion as a tribute to Joseph because it sounded similar and as a very firm proclamation of nationalism and republicanism. I said in this episode that the Battle of Beit Horon was the worst Roman defeat since the Civil Wars. That was wrong. I should have caught that. It was the worst Roman defeat since the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, where they lost 3 legions and significant Roman expansion into northern Europe was permanently ended. But that does open the door for me to talk some more about Roman and Jewish battle tactics. Now, it would be easy to look at the Romans and assume that they won with sheer numbers, but no. In fact, ever since the Punic Wars, the Roman army specialized in scoring easy victories against much bigger enemies. I keep thinking of Boudica, the Battle of Watling Street, where 2 Roman legions steamrolled an army of Britons 20 times their size. The strength of the Roman army was its organizational efficiency. And one thing Josephus and Simon Bar Giora had in common with the Germans at the Teutoburg Forest was that they understood Roman battle tactics, and they understood how to disrupt their organization by lulling them into a false sense of security through deception and psychological warfare. If Josephus and Bar Giora had teamed up, I think there's a decent chance that Judea could have won the war. But Josephus absolutely hated Simon Bar Giora. He hated him as much as he hated John of Giscala because, and I didn't get into this in the video at all, but Bar Giora was kind of a proto-socialist. When he took over Judea, he took over these country estates where the nobility were hoarding food and supplies, and he would usually kill the nobles if he found them doing this. And Josephus was a member of the nobility. He was a Cohen. I mentioned in this video that some of the Roman forces in the siege of Jerusalem were actually Jews from Egypt, or at least were led by one, the Alabarch of Alexandria. And while Josephus very much overstates the idea that a lot of Jews within Judea were against the revolt, and I'll talk more later about why I think he's saying that, it is true that Jews outside of Judea were much less supportive and in many cases actively opposed. I bring this up because although it might be argued that those diaspora communities didn't have much of a choice, except for the royal family, the oligarchy, the very elite, supporting Rome did not work out for them. And a prime example of this is the fact that after destroying the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the Romans then destroyed the Oniad Jewish temple at Leontopolis. So the Oniads, for those who missed the Maccabee era of my videos, were a branch of the Jewish high priesthood who ran the temple basically from the time of Alexander the Great to the Maccabean revolt, and having been ousted by the Hasmoneans, they went to Egypt and built their own temple. By the time of the Jewish War, the Oniads had long gone extinct, and this other temple had become more of a satellite location where Jews in Egypt, of which there were about 1 million, more than anywhere else besides Judea, could get the kind of priestly services that were available in the court of women in Jerusalem, but not a full temple with a sanctuary or sacrifices. If you find yourself in Egypt, Leontopolis is now a small town called Kafr el-Muqdam. So you might think that the Romans would try to use this location to rally Egypt's Jews against the revolt, but no. The anti-Semitism of the time was rapidly spreading through the Roman Empire, and it would eventually be adopted by early Christianity as a way to appeal to existing Roman sensibilities, and it demanded that the Jewish threat and Jewish power be neutralized. So we actually have a question from my Gaon level patron, Lev Cham. How did Jewish opinions on the Messiah become about a post-Temple Moshiach if it doesn't seem to be that originally, and what are the requirements of a post-Temple Moshiach? The idea of a Messiah is obviously something that had evolved very dramatically throughout Judaism up to this period. You had Hezekiah, who saved Judea's independence. You had Cyrus, who wasn't even Jewish, allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem. The idea of the Messiah, as we know it today, really does begin with the destruction of the temple. The lack of a temple lends itself pretty naturally to the idea of the Messiah as someone who will rebuild it, but the solidification of the Messiah as we think of it is indicative of the way that Judaism became kind of frozen in time with the temple's destruction, and especially later on with the dissolution of the Sanhedrin, which I'll talk about in a future episode. Because without this building to anchor the idea of Judaism, it became necessary for the tradition to take its place. This is something that very early Zionists were very critical of, like Moses Hess and Echad Ha'am, who said basically, without a homeland, we have become overly dependent on religion for our identity, and that is bad. It has made us weak, it has put us in danger, and the only solution is to re-anchor our identity in our homeland. And that isn't to say that Judaism didn't change after a certain point. At this point in history, no Jewish man has ever had a bar mitzvah. But that change took on a much more constitutionalist approach, where new arguments always had to be backed up by older ones. And we right now are actually living in the most extreme period of that attitude. As to the requirements of a post-temple Messiah, he must be a man, and he must be a direct male descendant of King David, who will rescue the Jewish people and take his place as king. This obviously comes from the influence of the Zealots, as I discussed in the Judean Tetrarchy, and he would either usher in a period of peace and moral perfection, or he would arrive only as a result of peace and moral perfection. There's some ambiguity there. So in my haste to debunk the legend of Masada, I neglected to mention that it is true that at least 10 of the Sicarii, including Eliezer ben Yair, did draw lots to kill each other, because we've actually found the shards of pottery that they wrote their names on to draw out of. I hope I made clear my issues with the legend. It has been very much lionized in modern times, especially as propaganda for the creation of Israel. In fact, all new recruits in the IDF are sworn in on top of Masada, and they say, Masada will never again fall. And that's very strange to me, because the Sicarii were not really defenders of the Jewish nation. And they very much rejected lasting Jewish ideas about survival. And in fairness, there is a lot more controversy about holding up this martyrdom as an ideal, because ultimately we are all descendants of those who survived, and believe that survival above all was right. Which brings us nicely to Josephus. Josephus's book, The Jewish War, only came out a year or two after the end of the war itself, so it was very current and very popular, and Josephus had to be very careful about how he characterized the war, and how he characterized himself. And this is why I said that his account was wrong in a very predictable way. The most notable is probably that Josephus drastically overstates the number of Jewish troops in any one battle. There's a general consensus that however many Jewish forces he says there were, you should divide them by half. And this reaches its maximum extreme when he says that over 1 million civilians were in Jerusalem. Jerusalem today does not have 1 million people, and that's an area of over 100 square kilometers. The city at its first century peak was somewhere around 3 square kilometers. And yeah, pilgrims, visitors are not residents, but 1 million people in 3 square kilometers at any time is still several times the peak daytime capacity of modern Manhattan, which has skyscrapers, so by any measure what he said was impossible. But at the same time, Josephus overestimates troop numbers. He also consistently understates public support for the Jewish war. His first book is at great pains to say that this was a fringe zealot operation and that everyone else was basically forced to fight it, and that's just empirically untrue. Josephus was a Sadducee. He was a conservative, and he was placed in charge of Judea's first line of defense. He was chosen without any military experience, and I don't think that would ever have happened if his loyalties were in question, or if he didn't believe at the outset that the Jews could win the war. But what is winning in this context? Even before the year of 4 emperors, the Great Sanhedrin had good reason to believe they would win. Now, I'm not talking about Jewish troops marching on Rome. The Zealots believed that was a possibility, but nobody else really bought into that. The reason most of the Great Sanhedrin thought they could win is that 3 years before the outbreak of the Jewish War, Rome and Parthia had fought a war over Armenia, which was still a client state like Judea had been. The war was very bloody and pretty inconclusive, so Rome and Parthia made a deal where the Parthians would get to put their king on the throne, but he would be a vassal to Rome. And this is the war that Nero threw his illegitimate triumph for. Now what's interesting about this is that Armenia itself really came out ahead. It got to keep its independence, and the Romans really had to tread lightly with it. So people like Simon ben Gamliel or Joseph ben Gurion would have been able to point to that and say, we could do that. And Ben-Gurion actually sought out an alliance with Parthia for that purpose. Now, Parthia didn't want to fight the Romans again, and in fact, I don't think the Parthians ever fought a war of aggression against Rome other than Antony's Parthian War, but that invitation is what brought the royal guard of Adiabene back to Jerusalem. So this will not be the last time we see or talk about Josephus. I will, in fact, cover more in the next episode what happened to all of the survivors of the Jewish War. But for now, I will say that Josephus not only outlived Vespasian, but outlived the entire Flavian dynasty. And it's really then, in the 90s, that he publishes the vast majority of his work, which is very different in tone from the Jewish War, and seems to say, I couldn't speak freely before, I did instead what I had to survive, and now I can tell you how I really feel. So look forward next time to Josephus's farewell, the fate of the Herodian and Hasmonean dynasty, and what links Judaism, MSG, and one of the ancient world's most famous natural disasters. Special thanks to my patrons, including Gaonim level patrons Lev Cham and Vicky Nelson. If you like this and want to support the channel, you too can become a patron on Patreon, linked in the description below. You can also find links to my sources for this video in the description, as well as a link to my book, An Armada of Cats Travels in Israel. Otherwise, you can always like, share, and subscribe. I will see you next time.